So in the Bible, big things happen on high mountains. And today, a big thing has happened. Jesus leads his inner circle of disciples. These are his apprentices. These are the ones who he believes are most open to what he's teaching them. And he leads them to a high mountain, and these strange and mysterious things start to happen. His face shines, his clothes become dazzling white, there's a bright cloud, and there are heavenly voices. But what I want to focus on today are the two people who stand there with Jesus, who appear with Jesus. And those two people are Moses and Elijah. And in order to understand the significance of their appearance, we need to understand some other things that have happened on high mountains, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. Because until we understand these events, we can't fully understand this. And we can't fully understand the other things that happen in the Gospel of Matthew that also happen on the mountaintop, including the Sermon on the Mount and the Great Commission at the end of Matthew. I think all of this helps give a more complete picture to what Jesus Christ is up to, not only then, but more importantly for us, right now. So Moses and Elijah are two of the most prominent figures in the Hebrew Scriptures. I mean, you could not pick two people who are more important to the biblical narrative and the Jewish people than Moses and Elijah. On Mount Sinai, Moses receives the tablets, the 10 commandments from God, and he brings those commandments down the mountain to the very people, passing on the law, giving their lives structure, purpose, focus, direction. But maybe even more important, they give the people an identity. From that point on, they are the people of the law. And then on Mount Carmel, Elijah has this showdown. He sets up this scenario where God and the prophets of Baal and Asherah have a competition. Elijah is upset because as a good Jew, he sees the culture around him and he sees how his Jews are worshiping the false gods in that culture and forgetting their call, their covenant to be faithful to Yahweh. And in this showdown, as you may know, Yahweh overpowers the false gods and he shows them to be powerless. And Israel repents and they return to their commitment, their covenant with Yahweh. Now all of this, I think, gives some depth and perspective to the words that I spoke about a couple weeks ago when we had one worship service. When Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them." Fast forward to today, I think Jesus is saying, don't think that I've come to diss Moses or dismiss Elijah. I'm talking with them. We're in conversation, but I'm going to lead you forward. I'm going to continue the work. I'm going to fulfill and complete the work that has been begun in Moses and Elijah. All of this, I think, gets even more interesting when we start to look at what it is that Elijah and Moses represent. And for this, I'm forever indebted to Walter Brueggemann, the great Old Testament scholar, who suggests that in the Old Testament there are three major sections. There is the law, the prophets, and the wisdom tradition. So who does Moses represent? He represents the law. Who does Elijah represent? He's the fiery prophet. And who does Jesus represent? He represents the wisdom of Job and the Psalms and Proverbs. He's wisdom incarnate. And if you overlay that with some of our understanding of human development and human consciousness, it gets even more interesting because what Moses represents is simple consciousness. Right, wrong, black, white. The place where all of us need to begin, right? Tell me what to do. Tell me who I am. Tell me what our people are about. This is simple consciousness. Who are the prophets? They invite us to critical thinking. They invite us into complex consciousness. We begin to see, well, wait a second, things aren't as black and white. They're not as good and bad. I mean, things are grayer. There's more nuance. And we begin to mature, and we go into that space. And what is wisdom? It's the capacity to hold things in tension. To see, sometimes this is right and sometimes that. It's non-dual consciousness, being able to see reality more deeply, to see into the gray, into the mystery a little bit more. That's where Jesus is leading us. And a simple way of saying that is that Moses represents order, Elijah represents disorder, and Jesus represents the reordering of things. Both are important in order to understand what Jesus is doing, because he is the wisdom of God in human flesh. He is the one who's able to see things that no one before him could see about reality, about God, about what real life is ultimately about. He's the one who reorders our life around Yahweh. He shows us what that looks like. He lives that centered place for all with eyes to see. So let's look at all three of those a little bit more deeply. Moses gets us started. He receives the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai, and he passes on these commandments, and these are great commandments. Don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't cheat, don't steal. Like, these are good teachings. We should never abandon these teachings, right? All of these gave the Jews a very clear idea of right and wrong. It was a very important starting point, a foundation for their lives. It gave them a sense of identity, what their life was going to be about, what they were going to focus. It's their container. It reminds them that God has chosen them and given them this very important law to direct their lives. And all of us begin there. We need to. This is our children learning right and wrong, good and bad. Can you imagine a child who has not been taught the basics of morality? Can you imagine a child that isn't taught, do not cheat, don't steal? Imagine. So we all begin here. We need to know what is expected of us. We need to know who our people are, what we're about. This is a healthy starting point for all of us. And we can't really mature unless we begin in that place. This is what we do in the church. We provide the container for our children to be able to live their lives. We set the foundation. Here are the expectations. This is what we're about. This is how we live. So that's Moses, the law. We begin with that structure, that order. He gets us started. But Elijah moves us forward. On Mount Carmel, he reveals the power of God and the powerlessness of the false gods. Prophets are people who aren't at home in the world or in the tribe because they're pointing things out about the world that the world doesn't want to hear. They point out the fact that we're worshiping the false gods of money and prestige and privilege and power, and we don't want to hear that, right? But the prophets also point out how the tribe is not living into its best self, using the very ideals of that tribe to point out how unfaithful we are. A prophet tells us that we are, in essence, most of us, practical atheists, functional atheists. We say we believe in God, but when push comes to shove, our lives don't look very much different than anybody else's. We're worshiping the almighty dollar. We're keeping up with the Joneses. We're doing all the things that Jesus says we ought not to do. Prophets point that out. And it is a stage of maturity. Our teenagers, our adolescents are beginning to enter into that stage. And of course, in the beginning of adolescence, they see everything else. They see how mom and dad aren't living up to their ideas. You tell me to do this, how come you're not doing it? They see what's happening in our culture. They're the ones that are sometimes most awake to the way that we pillage the environment, the way that we treat each other, the way that we misuse power. Children, listen to our children. They are seeing some important things, right? But the journey for the adolescent is then to begin to look at themselves, to bring that same critical thinking, that same prophetic eye to their own lives, their own choices. the decisions that they're making, the direction that they're headed. The gift of this stage is we begin to recognize that, life isn't as clear, it's not as black and white as we thought it. It's not always this, it's not always that. And this complex consciousness begins to get at some of these things. This is a scary time because the container starts to crack a little bit. The foundation begins to shift. And if a church or a community isn't healthy, what they'll try to do is get their kid to double down on order, a false order. A healthy community provides space for those who critique that very community. In fact, a healthy community encourages questions. It encourages wrestling with things. It encourages different ways of looking at, applying, for example, the teachings of Jesus. Hopefully, we're a church that allows for this. There are churches that don't. I hope that we're not one of those. Which leads to Jesus. Jesus is the next stage of development, the final stage of development. And by standing with Moses and Elijah, he's saying order and disorder have their place. They're important in the good and sacred work of God in this world. And Jesus isn't leading us back to a false order. He's not doubling down on the 10 Commandments and saying, that's it. No, he's not saying that. And he's not keeping us stuck in disorder, which some people want to do. He's leading us forward through disorder towards a reordering around God. That's what Jesus was doing last week. If you were here, Liz preached a sermon on this very text. Jesus says, you've heard it said, do not murder, right? He says, but I say to you, do not harbor anger. Feel the difference? He's not saying, we should start murdering each other. No, he's saying, yeah, we shouldn't murder. Got that. That's important. Glad we all are on the same page on that. But we also ought not to harbor anger. We ought not to let that anger lead to that kind of quiet, cold rage, that seething thing that can poison a community, right? He's getting at inner disposition. He's getting at the things that linger beneath the surface that impact a community in an unhealthy way. He's getting at the toxicity of the community. He says, do not commit adultery. Who would argue with that? I hope we don't start arguing about that. Right? Do not commit adultery. You've heard it said, but I say to you, don't pour fuel on your lust. Don't look at each other and see an object to exploit or to manipulate. Don't go there, because that will destroy community. It's harder to see. We can say, well, we're not committing adultery. Well, no, you're not. That's true. But by objectifying others, by seeing them as a pawn in your game, you're doing something even worse. See where he's going? Order, disorder, leading to a reordering. Because Jesus doesn't just care about outer behavior. He cares about our inner disposition. He cares about the health of the community. And so by standing with Moses and Elijah, we better understand the love of Jesus as a love that includes a sense of right and wrong, but also has some prophetic disordering impulse in our lives. Jesus' love strokes us and kicks us. Jesus' love loves us just the way we are, but refuses to let us stay stuck there. Jesus meets us where we are and leads us to a better place. He comforts the afflicted and he afflicts the comfortable. At our men's retreat this fall, I shared one of my favorite icons, which was discovered in the Sinai desert at the monastery there. It's called Christ's Pantocrator. And in this icon, is the face of Jesus, and there are two very distinct eyes, and they're just radically different. The one eye looks at us with just infinite warmth and mercy, compassion. It's as if that I is Jesus saying, I love you. I love you just the way you are. There's nothing you can do to make me love you more, and there's nothing you can do to make me love you less. And we need that. We need that I. But there's a second I. And this I is fierce. It pierces and penetrates us. And we kind of don't even want to look at it. But it's a part of his love. And that I is looking at us and saying, cut it out. Stop the madness. Grow up. Mature. Stop talking about it. Do it. Enough already. And both of these are a part of love. Imagine if in your marriage, your spouse, 20 years into the marriage, still thinks you're perfect. You're the greatest person in the world. Could you imagine how unhealthy that marriage would be? Or imagine in raising your child, you look at your teenager and you say, oh, he's just, they walk on water. They're the greatest kids in the whole world. Imagine how unhealthy that situation would be. Or the opposite. This is the worst teenager in history. They're both not true, I promise you. And your spouse, she's not the best, and I promise you she's not the worst. He's not the best, not the worst. The love of God in Jesus Christ is infinite mercy and harsh judgment. We don't want to see it. We don't want to experience it. But that's what real love. Can you think about people in your life who have changed your life for the better? Haven't they gotten in your face in a loving way and challenged you to live your life better than you're currently living? Haven't you had people in your life who saw something in you, a potential in you to be a better human being than you were in that moment, and they helped you and challenged you to live into the ideals that you aspire to live by? The love of Jesus is like that. This is where law and prophets are leading us, to the fulfillment of the law. And this experience of this full and complete love is always disorienting. It's always confusing and hard and challenging. And Lent is a time where we go into that space. We go into the hardest teachings, which we're going to do beginning Wednesday. We're going to work with the Beatitudes. And let me just say selfishly, I think the reason I picked them is because sometimes I don't have a clue what he's talking about. Not a clue. What are you talking about, Jesus? But the reason I keep returning to it is because on the mountain in Matthew, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, what are the first words out of Jesus' mouth? It's the Beatitudes. So it must be important. There must be something there for me, as I know that there is for all of us. So we're going to spend some time, and these are hard teachings, and we're going to take one a week, one beatitude a week, the ninefold path of the Christian journey. So what's Jesus going to be teaching us? He's going to be teaching us what happy people look like. People through whom God is blessing the world. And these are not what we learn from conventional wisdom. Jesus is saying that the happiest people are not those who have everything figured out. No, actually, the happiest people are those who realize how little they have figured out and remain perpetually, eternally teachable. Those are the happiest people. The happiest people are not those who protect themselves from grief and wall off the pain and numb the pain. No, the happiest people are those who are open to grief and grieving, open to the sufferings of life, and trusting suffering to do its good and sacred work in our lives. The happiest people are not those who are trying to be more than they are or less than they are. No, the happiest people are those who are content with being human beings. Those are the happiest. The happiest people are not those who satisfy every longing. No. The happiest people are those who make space for that deep ache, who understand that part of the journey is learning how to be perpetually discontent and to be okay with that. Jesus is going to teach us that the happiest people are not those who are always right. The happiest people are those who look back on their lives and say, man, have I been wrong? And are willing to talk about it and admit it. Jesus is going to teach about those that the happiest people are not those who look all prim and proper and perfect on the outside. No, the happiest people are inviting God to perfect them from the inside out, to do the work that only God can do in the human soul. The happiest people are not those who are competing with everybody else and winning. No. The happiest people are those who are learning how to collaborate and to cooperate and to work with others. The happiest people are not those who are trying to avoid criticism at all times. No. The happiest people are those who are willing to speak up and to stand out and to risk the discomfort of speaking the truth with love. Jesus is going to teach us that the happiest people are not those who are liked by everyone. He's such a great guy. She is so amazing. No, the happiest people are those who are willing at times, when appropriate, to rub people the wrong way. So we're going to wrestle with the Beatitudes. And we're going to understand maybe a little bit more what Jesus means by happiness and those who are blessed. In Matthew, the transfiguration literally leads right into the passion narrative. These disciples literally come down the mountain from their mountaintop experience and get into the messy, gritty part of life, exemplified and embodied in the passion narrative. And they walk with Jesus, rather unsuccessfully, through his betrayal, denial, through his crucifixion, through the end of his movement, and then the mysterious reemergence of him and the movement itself. And Lent is a time to remember those events, but even more importantly, it's a time to recognize that this is the pattern we all must go through if we are to grow up. Order, disorder, reorder. Most of us want to do that plane trip from order to reorder. We want to skip the disorder part. That's not how it works. We got to go through the dark, cold winter in order for the spring seedlings to emerge. And in fact, we are conditioned to think nothing's happening in the winter, but God knows a whole heck of a lot is happening beneath the surface. And the same is true in your life and in mine. And in Lent, we give God permission to bring forth the fruit of God's work in the human soul. Lent is a challenging time as we face our fears about where Jesus Christ is leading us. It's a little more prophet than law. It's a little bit more of that fierce, penetrating eye than that unconditional love eye. But that's how it is with human growth. It's always a little scary. It's always uncomfortable. And yet we look back 99.99% of the time. Aren't we grateful that we're a little more mature today than we were then? But as we journey through Lent, through this uncomfortable, sometimes frightening time, I hope you'll remember two other things that happened on the mountain today in the Gospel of Matthew. Because I think both of these can keep our eye on the ball and trust God's intentions of leading us into these places. Because we are called to trust the slow work of God. So today in the text, there's this beautiful moment where the disciples are scared. I mean, who among us wouldn't be scared? All this crazy stuff's happening. Moses, Elijah, what is going on? Voices, right? So they're scared. They fall to their knees. And what does Jesus do? Jesus alone. No Moses, no Elijah. They're gone. He walks towards them. He puts his hand, touches them, and says, get up. We're going to do this. Don't be afraid. And then at the end of Matthew, after all the passion and all the events that lead to his death, and then the resurrection and empty tomb and disciples that are confused and scared and all that stuff, Jesus leads them again to a high mountain. He gives them a task. He says, go out in the world. You got to work, got to go out, make disciples of all nations. You got to be disciples, all that stuff. Yeah. But remember, I'm with you always. If you're like me in your life, you circle around to those same issues. Why am I still here again? Well, we just keep coming back, right? We go a little bit deeper each time, right? But here's what I want to invite you to trust, because Lent's going to bring it up for you. It's going to bring up the stuff you don't want to look at. And what I invite you to do is trust God's intentions for that. God is not bringing that back into your life to keep you stuck. No. God is showing you that what's in the way is the way. Let us pray. Lord, we promise this Lent to climb the mountain with you and to open our minds and our hearts and our soul to your essential teachings. Help us to live with the Beatitudes the way the Jews lived with the Ten Commandments. Help us to carry them around with us wherever we go, to recognize that they are your gift to us forever. May this season be a time of renewal. May we become more empowered to be the little Christs you call us to be. And may we find ways to work together with this community and others to bring forth and to share good news of your love and your power for all people. Amen.